Hello, my name is Lena Vincent, and you are listening to my group's final podcast for our 340S service learning class. The voices you will be hearing in this podcast today are of our interviewer, Carmen Lavilla, and our interviewee, Professor Shreya Shrestha of Cal State University, Monterey Bay. Professor Shrestha is a lecturer on feminist theories and methods, and we decided that she would be a wonderful subject to interview for our podcast on the feminist movement and the Me Too movement. We have a lot of great contributors who helped us out on this podcast. Our lead researchers were Alondra Medina and Zaiyda Brison. Our audio editors were myself, Lena Vincent, and Fatima Mendoza. And we received a great amount of support from our professor, Kristen Lafayette. So without further ado, please enjoy our podcast on feminist movement and the Me Too movement.
Thank you so much for making the time for this interview, and thank you again for coming to our podcast. And we're just so appreciative that you were able to join us today. And yeah, we're here just wanting to talk more about feminism and specifically the Me Too movement. And I think just before we transition into this like bigger and main discussion, I just wanted to ask and just provide more context to you and learn more about you and your background, your experience, your connections to feminism.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me and inviting me. I feel really honored to be here, and I'm glad that when you wanted to explore this topic, you wanted to ask me about it. So I appreciate that. Feminism for me, in terms of like life, I mean, I think feminism is like one of those things that's really interesting that for at least in my experience and a lot of women that I know, it's like something that they started kind of being drawn to at a pretty young age because you start noticing certain kinds of contradictions or things that feel unfair in your own immediate like surroundings, whether that's like your family or your community or at school. But this sense that there's a way that you're being treated that isn't about who you are as a person, but instead is about like this social position that you're in. Most of us, right, inhabit multiple social positions, but if one of them is being a woman or a girl, I think that can be how a lot of us are first kind of drawn to feminism, right? So simple things like growing up, whether it was my parents or my community, it seemed like the expectation was like helping out with dishes or helping out like making tea for everybody at the end of a family party. There was more expectation that girls would do that than boys, right? And so early on, I was like, what's this about? This doesn't seem fair. Boys were usually given more freedom, right, to go out at night and to go out with their friends and things like that. Starting to think about like, okay, how does something like gender, whether you're perceived as a boy or girl, how does that impact like how you're treated? Feminism has always drawn different groups of people, right, who are just interested in this question of how do we address issues of harm to women or gender justice. It's difficult because I think one narrative, say the feminist movement of the 1960s was mostly white feminists, and then, in the 80s, there was like a rise in women of color feminism. But I think, women of color and white women and all kinds of people have always been fighting for issues related to justice for women and gender justice. There were always women of color involved. There were always like poor and working class women involved. Sometimes women didn't identify as feminists, right? But they were, so like during the 1960s, when there was like certain feminists, like liberal feminists, which was dominated by middle class women and white women, were fighting for like equal pay and like the right, better access to employment outside of the home. There were like women of color feminists and women of color who were not identifying as feminists all the time necessarily, who were fighting for like kind of the opposite, like things like welfare benefits so that they could have the option to stay home with their children. There's always been really different perspectives, even like what's considered like the first wave, like with the suffrage movement, right? When women were struggling for the right to vote, feminism wasn't a term really during that time. They were fighting for certain things that like poor and working class women and women of color weren't necessarily relating to. And so it's very complicated. And so I think for me, it's like feminism has always been just like any other kind of social movement. There are different tendencies, different political analyses that are sort of competing. And sometimes maybe a sense of unity is desirable, but I also am okay with the fact that sometimes some feminists, like they're building solidarity with like other working class people or other incarcerated people, and they're not necessarily as interested in building coalition or solidarity with other women who aren't interested in those issues. You know what I mean? And I think that's fine. That's like a difference. It's a difference in perspective.
Right. We wanted to have more input as well into how do you think the feminist movement more like today?
I think there is like it's sort of like an internet feminism and the use of social media. And I think for activism in general, one of the things I think, social media is a tool that can be used for social movements, just like any other tool, right? But people feel like that's the work, right? As opposed to actually trying to figure out, what are the problems in our communities and how might feminists respond to them? At the same time, that there are these movements, like you all wanted to talk more about Me Too and other efforts that use social media as a tool to bring attention to social issues. It's very clear that women and queer people, right, have taken a really important role in that. And that many of the leading voices in those movements and the leading activists are also women or queer people of color. And I think that impacts the way they approach the activism, not in like getting attention or power or ego for themselves, but actually like supporting more non-hierarchical, more collective forms of activism and understanding that, yes, we have to do this work, but we also have to build connection and love each other, right? So things that I think are really powerful and are really exciting to see that are happening.
Thank you so much for all your input, Tria. And I think right now we would like to transition into the more narrower focus of our podcast, which is more talking about the hashtag #MeToo movement.
Mhm.
And we just wanted to ask where the hashtag came from and how it really impacted society since its development.
The person who kind of founded the hashtag Me Too was Tarana Burke, who was a Black feminist who's been doing a lot of work around violence against Black women and girls for decades as a community organizer and activist. I think she kind of created the Me Too hashtag in order to bring attention to issues of violence against Black women and girls, which we know sort of, unfortunately, historically in the United States, even as there have been sort of feminist and women's movements that tried to bring attention to these issues, right? Because for a very long time, sort of sexual violence and domestic violence were sort of seen as personal issues when they occurred between like family members or acquaintances. There wasn't a lot of attention how that same violence was impacting women of color and how their experiences of that violence or their responses to that violence might be a little bit different, but also that we have a very real history in the United States and a present reality, right, of sort of systematic violence against women of color, whether that's through institutions like slavery, right, where there was like widespread violence against Black women as part of their enslavement, facilitate forms of violence and sexual violence against women. So
Right.
I think the Me Too in the way that Tarana Burke envisioned it was initially to really just bring attention to that for Black women. And then in the more recent iteration, right, where it was kind of picked up by a lot of people working in Hollywood specifically or in the entertainment industry, was because there was, we were starting to see more recognition. I think around the time that a lot of people in the entertainment industry, especially with like the exposure of these like very, very powerful figures in Hollywood, whether initially that was someone like Bill Cosby, right, who was not just like a comedian, right? He was an institution, right? He was able to go from being a comedian to then being the star of a television series and getting a lot of recognition and power. But then also Harvey Weinstein, which was even more so, right? Because he was probably one of the most powerful sort of film producers in all of Hollywood, right? And so I think it was Alyssa Milano, who was a television star from the 80s. She's the one who used that hashtag Me Too, and then to kind of, because it was people who had been victims of sexual violence in the entertainment industry, like coming out basically and sharing that. And I think that's where pretty immediately, like people were like, oh, actually, this was started by Tarana Burke, and a lot of these women in the entertainment industry were very quick to give her credit and wanted to recognize that, right? And so that's sort of, and it really kind of took off in this moment where there was a lot of attention being paid to people working in the entertainment industry, often very high profile, right? Wanting to come out and talk about their experience. But I remember there was also a version of it where it was like a lot of people posting about how they respond to the experience of living in fear of sexual violence. So things like, if I'm walking down the street at night, I like carry my keys in my hand, or every time I get into my car at night, I check the back seat to see if someone's in it, right? And other people saying, me too, I do that too, right? So there are all these kind of trying to put a lens on things that are hidden. And I think what it was trying to say is like, listen, like the fear of sexual violence and incidents of sexual violence are all around us, right? That things are not just happening to a few people or a minor problem, but these are widespread systematic issues that in huge portions of the population, right? So I think that's that's a very effective way to use something like a hashtag. And that's an effective way to use social media because it's a very unique medium that can allow for that to happen, right? So people, by hashtagging, you link all these individual experiences. I think that was important. I think that's unique.
The support is palpable when you see the hashtag. And I think like one of the questions that we had written up was, why do you think women and people in general don't report their sexual harassment or assault experiences immediately and sometimes not at all, and how the Me Too movement really has encouraged people to speak up. And I know you were mentioning in terms of visibility, how it's created this like community online and just like been rallying people, but could you elaborate on that?
Already in our society, we have a lot of issues around sort of shame as it relates to like our bodies and, sexuality and sexual desire, right? So there's like a stigma against all various kinds of sex, right? And sexual desire. On the one hand, I think part of it is that, right? And that comes from many sources, including religion, but also various other ways in which like our society is structured. And so part of it is like anytime I think there's so much vulnerability that people feel, not only in the violation, right, where someone interacting with your body, which is so vulnerable and so personal in a way that is against your wishes, right? That is like a very, very traumatic experience. But then on top of that, it very easily kind of triggers these feelings of like shame and fear. But I think another thing that it triggers for a lot of people is a feeling of doubt. Part of the problem is that the way that we look at violence and sexual violence is through kind of like a criminal justice lens, which is always looking for a perpetrator and a victim. And the perpetrator is often like demonized and seen as like kind of an evil individual, right? And in some cases, people who experience sexual violence may experience that person like that. There are also times when that person is also your boyfriend or your friend or your roommate or someone that you thought was cool, but then violates you and doesn't like listen to your isn't interested in gaining your consent or making sure that you know what I mean? So it's very complicated. But I think part of what that serves to do is make us think like people who are victims of sexual violence and people who are perpetrators of sexual violence are not the norm. And I think so that there's always this, for a lot of victims of sexual violence, there's a sense of doubt. Like, was it as bad as I thought? Was it really that kind of violation? Because our criminal justice framework makes us think of like, well, is this person the bad guy? But if we think about it more in terms of, this is my body and things happened to me that didn't feel good, that didn't feel right, that felt like a violation, that's what should matter. And then what we do about it can be any number of things, depending on what happened, how it happened, who was involved. And there might be a number of different ways that might be best for any given individual to like resolve that issue. I think we need to pay a lot of attention to, like, Me Too was sort of launched by people in the entertainment industry, right? So you're talking about someone like Harvey Weinstein is probably one of the most powerful and wealthy men in the United States, right? And so we also have to look at the fact that very often people who are victims of sexual violence, they're also vulnerable because, for example, the person who's violating them might be a family member, right? So they risk
Right.
losing the support and the protection of their family if they share what happened. Or it might be their boss, right? Their manager or the person that they're working for. So they also run the risk of losing their employment if they come out about what happened to them, right? And then because we have this criminal justice lens, if people try to talk about what happened to them, if it's something where you're trying to say it's a crime, the police notoriously are not very helpful and supportive, right? So it was found
Right.
a few years ago, there was like a Newsweek study that found there are hundreds of rape kits, right? Which is what is supposed to be used to gather bodily evidence when someone says that they were sexually assaulted or raped. That there are thousands of kits all over the United States and police departments that have never been processed. One, they may not care. And two, if they do care, you're one of the very rare cases where people like come forward and there's a legal response. Very often, whether that's you come forward for a legal response or even to your own family members, right? Most of the people I know who've been victims of sexual violence from within their family, the adult they chose to tell very often didn't believe them or told them to keep quiet about it, right?
Right.
So there's a very real feeling that you're already talking about something that brings up a lot of shame and embarrassment and
Right.
doubt and fear. And that very often the response that you get isn't a supportive one, isn't one that is going to make you feel better, let alone make the situation better and make you safer.
It's kind of like a disruptive narrative. And I feel like with that in mind, like it's like silencing it is such a, you know, big thing that happens because it is very vulnerable.
And also being able to talk about sexual violence in a way that like really understands that sexual violence is about power, right?
Yes.
Sex in a patriarchal society, you have situations where you have one group of people with power over another, and
Right.
sex becomes a tool for exercising that power in really horrible ways. But that also means that we have to pay attention to the fact that yes, women are socially vulnerable because of their gender in a gender hierarchy where straight men are above straight women and cis women and genderqueer people. But also, there is a lot of violence in general, and particularly sexual violence, that we do not look at closely enough between men. That very often in homosocial spaces, men will also exercise sexual violence against each other, right?
Yes.
Because it's really not about the gender of the victim primarily, although gender plays into how people are made vulnerable, but it's about like people wanting to dominate others, right?
Yeah.
And so it's not surprising that a lot of the Me Too movement, when it was focused on the entertainment industry, right, it was actresses or actors. I mean, it depends, whichever one you want to use, but people who are being given the people who were vulnerable because they were the ones who are looking for work, right? They're looking for a job. They want to be successful in this industry, and the people who have the power to either give them that or deny them that are men. What's important is they had an excuse to exercise this
Right.
power over women, right? And it also happens, unfortunately, right, within families as well, right? An older sibling or a parent figure or an uncle figure who then exercises that violence against children of all genders, because again, children are the most vulnerable people in
Right.
society, right? So, of course, the idea of like speaking out against not only about something that's really can be very shameful and be very embarrassing and that you might have doubt about, but then you're speaking out most of the time against someone who has very real power over you.
Thank you so much, Ria, for your input. And yeah, it's just super important to acknowledge that dynamic of like sex as power.
Which sucks, right? Because sex is supposed to be, it
Sucks.
should be awesome and fun and like about consent and pleasure.
Right.
It's really like, it's part of like the violence of like all kinds of systems of inequality or
Right.
hierarchy, right? That instead it becomes a way to hurt people and to dominate people.
To just kind of transition back into our course back into
Yeah.
the Me Too movement. I know you were mentioning earlier kind of basically like transformative justice and how the criminal
Yeah.
justice system kind of operates very unfairly in how we approach and very like nuanced issues. And I think with that in mind, one of the people that I can really think of were like the forefront of this movement, of the Me Too movement, but also kind of like one of the faces of like restorative justice, transformative justice is Cyntoia Brown, and she's just a very extraordinary woman with a very heartbreaking history. And I think for those unfamiliar, could you describe her case and elaborate on what it means for the future of this movement and society in general?
Yeah, I think Cyntoia Brown's case, and I think, I think it's an important one, right? Going to that question of why people don't report. So there are a lot of reasons why people don't want to talk about it, but part of it is, and this is I kind of mentioned this earlier, which is like the survived and punished movement, right? So very often, if you're a survivor of domestic violence or sexual assault, your race, your class, all these different things can factor into whether or not you're believed as a victim, right? And so Cyntoia Brown was 16 years old when she started running away from home, get in and out of juvenile hall, right? And was really labeled pretty early on. And so when she ran away, an adult man who named, she calls him Cutthroat, was his sort of street name. Right? He kind of said that they were in a relationship, but really his intention was to put her out for prostitution for his own gain, right? At 16 years old, she was doing this kind of sex work. There was an adult man who paid to have sex with her, Johnny Allen. I think he was in his late 30s, early 40s, and she was like 15 or 16. And she was over at his house and he started acting erratically and he was like showing her his huge gun collection and she just started feeling more and more scared. And so at one point she started really feeling like this person was going to hurt her. And she had a gun, I think, in her bag that Cutthroat had given her, right? Because doing sex work is really dangerous. And so she took out the gun because she was really afraid this guy was going to kill her, and she ended up killing him. And so there's a couple things to say there. Like if you look at her now, she was released through clemency, right? So the governor, I believe, pardoned her, and she's now in her early 30s, I think. So if you look back to when she was actually arrested and charged and went to trial, she looked like a baby, right? She was like, so she was 15, but like it's alarming because she really looks like a little kid. And despite that, right, the attorney that was trying to get her prosecuted for killing Johnny Allen was able to really successfully convince the judge, convince the jury that she was a violent, conniving perpetrator of crime and that she had a history of being a sort of bad, troublemaking kid. And they were convinced of that. And she was convicted and she was put into prison. From the beginning, she had a lawyer who saw her for who she was, right? Saw that she was a victim. There were many activist and feminist groups that were involved in supporting her. And so eventually they were able to get her clemency, right? And she got out. She was supposed to serve what would essentially have been like another, decades in prison, but they were able to get her released. I think that her supporters were very strategic. And they saw that as the Me Too movement was gaining steam and it was bringing to like public discussion about how widespread and how real sexual violence is and how often people who experience it are just like ignored. I think they saw that as an opportunity to bring attention to the case of this young woman. And they were able to get celebrities like Rihanna and Kim Kardashian to like tweet out and support her. So all of those things kind of came together, and luckily that pressure and all of those circumstances helped her get released early.
I think it's just a really great, like, kind of depiction, like, in spite of the struggles, it's a depiction of what community and the power of people when they really recognize something that is, like, inherently wrong with the justice system,
Oh,
and also,
absolutely.
like, they really, once people mobilize, they really refuse
Yeah.
to, to quit until justice is served.
Yeah.
We want to posit the question of what are some of the reasons really people reject the Me Too movement, as well as some of the criticism it's received, because it's definitely shedding light on these experiences. And I know we've mentioned it briefly as well again, but like, why do some people counter this movement?
I think there are many ways to think about that, right? So, and I think there are different kinds of criticisms, right? So there might be criticisms from people who just aren't really interested in stopping forms of gender-based violence or sexual violence, right? And so they'll come up with various kinds of excuses to discount the movement, right? Saying things like, oh, these are like people can just make whatever kind of accusation,
Right.
devastate people's lives, and it's unfair, right? So I think part of what I would argue is that, like I said, I do think the hashtag is good. It brings attention. But like a lot of social media activism, it has really strong limits. There's not a lot of nuance that you can bring into. I do think it's more helpful for us to be able to think about how sexual violence is a tool of domination. Also, it's a hashtag, right? So it's harder for us to have sometimes these deeper conversations. So the hashtag is really good at opening up something, right? But then there's a lot more work that has to be done beyond that. And then I also think, hashtags and posting on social media, even though that is much more popularized than it was before, so there's a potential criticism from people who don't necessarily think that as a strategy, it does everything that needs to be done. So it's only one part of a much broader set of actions that we need to take.
Thanks for listening to our podcast. That was Carmen Lavilla conducting an interview with Shreya Shrestha, a CSUMB lecturer on feminist theories and methods, who we would like to thank for taking the time to discuss the feminist and Me Too movements and how they have impacted society. We would also like to recognize the research conducted by Alondra Medina and Zaiyda Brison, as well as Lena Vincent and myself, Fatima Mendoza, for writing and editing this episode. If we have inspired you to take a deeper dive into the feminist movement and its history, we encourage you to listen to our second episode and learn what you can do to support the feminist movement. Again, thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed learning more about these movements as much as we did. See you next time.